Buried alive, Samuel Herrera's fate seemed sealed, until his daughter's cries shattered the silence. What follows is a chilling battle for truth, justice, and survival against unimaginable betrayal. The church trembled with fear as frantic knocks echoed from inside the coffin. "Don't open it!" Henry shrieked, his face drained of color. But Clara's hands refused to stop. She had to know the truth. As the lid creaked open, gasps filled the air. What they found inside would change everything. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. The mournful toll of the church bells echoed through the stone walls of St. Michael's Church, their deep, solemn chimes blending with the quiet sobs of the grieving. A thick veil of sorrow hung in the air, settling over the mourners like an inescapable fog. Clara stood motionless beside her husband's coffin, her arms wrapped tightly around little Lucy. The 2-year-old whimpered, her tiny fists clutching at her mother's black dress. Her face, streaked with tears, was flushed from the hours of crying. "Papa," she choked, her voice small yet piercing. She pointed a trembling finger toward the coffin. "Papa is calling me." Clara's breath hitched. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she clutched her mourning veil tighter. Samuel's sudden death felt like an impossible nightmare. Just yesterday, he had kissed her goodbye before leaving the house. And now, all that remained was his lifeless body, entombed in polished wood. Whispers rippled through the gathered villagers. None could comprehend how a strong, healthy man like Samuel had perished so suddenly. Some murmured of an accident. Others, in hushed, fearful tones, spoke of fate's cruel punishment. An elderly woman, Madame Rose, stepped forward, her wrinkled hands trembling as she touched Clara's shoulder. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of experience. "My dear, I know your grief is unbearable, but little Lucy, are you sure she is well?" Clara glanced down at her daughter and froze. Lucy's wide, glassy eyes were locked onto the darkened corner of the church, her tiny body shaking. Then she screamed, a blood-curdling cry that silenced the whispers. "Papa! Papa is trapped! He's calling for help!" A murmur of unease spread through the crowd. Nervous glances were exchanged. Some made the sign of the cross. Others took a cautious step back. Madame Rose gasped, covering her mouth. "Dear Lord, the child can see." The words hung heavy in the air, sending a chill through Clara's bones. She dropped to her knees, gripping Lucy's arms. Her heart pounded. "Lucy, sweetheart," she whispered, fighting to steady her voice. "What do you mean? Papa is... He's resting now." Lucy shook her head fiercely. "No, Mama, he's not. He's there." She pointed again, her tiny hand quivering. "Papa is calling for you. He's trapped in the dark." A gust of wind swept through the church, extinguishing several candles near the altar. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows across the coffin. The oppressive silence stretched unbearably. Then, the heavy doors of the church groaned open. A tall figure stepped inside. Henry, Samuel's cousin, dressed in a tailored black suit. He cut an imposing figure against the dim candlelight. His sharp gaze swept over the room before settling on Clara. A slow, measured smile curled his lips, sympathetic, yet strangely hollow. "Clara," he said, his voice a velvet whisper, "you must be exhausted. We are all heartbroken over Samuel's passing." Clara barely acknowledged him, her grip on Lucy tightening. The child buried her face against her mother's chest, trembling. Henry's eyes flickered toward her. "She's too young to understand. Best not to let her words unsettle the others." His tone carried an unsettling sharpness. Clara stiffened. "She's grieving for her father," she said, her voice clipped. Henry let out a small, almost condescending sigh. "Of course." A pause. Then, as if he had merely been waiting for the right moment, he continued, "Clara, I hate to bring this up now, but you know Samuel left behind a significant amount of financial trouble. The house, it may be best to consider selling it to settle his debts." Clara's breath caught. "Sell the house? It would be the wisest course of action," Henry pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Samuel was a good man, but we both know he had his struggles." A cold dread slithered into Clara's chest. Something about Henry's demeanor set her on edge. Why was he speaking of money now? Lucy suddenly clung to her mother tighter. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto Henry. "Papa is trapped," she whispered, her voice eerily clear. Henry's expression flickered. The tension in the church thickened, pressing in like an unseen force. Those nearest to them edged away, whispering amongst themselves. Clara crouched down, brushing Lucy's damp curls from her face. "Lucy, sweetheart, what do you mean?" Lucy's tiny fingers gripped the fabric of her mother's dress. "Papa hasn't left. He's still here. He's calling for you, Mama." A suffocating silence settled over the church. Margaret, a woman standing nearby, clutched at her neighbor's sleeve. "This is a bad omen," she whispered. "A child so pure wouldn't lie." Clara's breath quickened. The flickering candlelight made the shadows dance wildly across the walls. Henry's jaw clenched. He let out a forced chuckle. "Children have vivid imaginations," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. His hands twitched at his sides. Clara studied him closely, and then she saw it. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. His fingers tapped against the wooden pew, a nervous tick. His eyes, which had always held an unnerving confidence, darted away. He was afraid. But of what? A sudden gust of wind howled through the church, extinguishing the last of the candles. Darkness swallowed the room. And then a sound, a faint, rasping whisper, coming from the coffin. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners. Some stumbled back, knocking over pews in their haste. Others covered their mouths, their eyes wide with terror. Henry stiffened. His face, once so composed, twisted in barely concealed panic. Clara's heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. Then, a single, unmistakable knock. From inside the coffin, Lucy's small voice cut through the suffocating silence. "Papa wants to come out." The air inside St. Michael's Church was thick with grief, the scent of melting candle wax mingling with the damp chill of the stone walls. The villagers stood in hushed clusters, their sorrowful murmurs barely audible over the hollow tolling of the church bells. But beneath their mourning, an unspoken fear simmered. Clara stood beside the heavy oak coffin, her fingers trembling as she held her daughter, Lucy, close. The child clung to her, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of her mother's dress as though she feared being torn away. "Papa is still here," Lucy whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Clara's chest tightened. She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat, willing away the creeping dread. "Lucy, darling," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Papa has gone to rest." But Lucy shook her head violently, her tear-streaked face filled with something deeper than sorrow, something closer to terror. "He's trapped, Mama," she whimpered. "He's calling me. He's scared." The words sent a cold shudder through Clara's bones. Unnecessary fear. Henry's voice cut through the tense silence. He stepped forward, forcing a weak smile. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. Anxiety, perhaps? "There's no need to let a child's imagination unsettle everyone," he continued, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. Madame Rose, the oldest woman in the village, silently made the sign of the cross. She whispered, almost to herself, "There are things beyond our understanding. Sometimes children can see what adults cannot." A heavy silence settled over the room. Clara felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She gripped Lucy tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. Henry blinked rapidly, clearing his throat as if trying to shake off the tension. He turned back to Clara. his voice adopting a more businesslike tone. "Clara, I'm only trying to help," he said, his words smooth but insistent. "We should settle the matter of the house and Samuel's assets before it's too late. If Samuel were here, he would want you to handle everything quickly." Clara's stomach twisted. She could barely process his words. The weight of grief, fear, and uncertainty crushed her chest. "Can you leave me alone for a moment?" she said, her voice laced with steel. A flicker of irritation crossed Henry's face, though he masked it quickly. "I'm only trying to help," he repeated, but this time there was an edge to his voice. Then, lowering it slightly, he added, "If you're too stubborn, I may have no choice but to involve the law." His veiled threat sent an icy chill down Clara's spine. Margaret, a woman from the village, clicked her tongue and whispered to the person beside her, "Absolutely heartless. The man isn't even buried yet, and he's already talking about assets." But Henry didn't seem to care about the murmurs around him. He adjusted his cuffs, his expression unreadable. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said smoothly. "Hopefully by then, you'll have thought things through." With that, he turned and strode out of the church, his polished shoes echoing ominously against the stone floor. Clara barely noticed him leave. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her mind racing. It wasn't just Henry's words that unsettled her. It was the way he had reacted when Lucy spoke of her father, the way his face had stiffened, the way his hands had curled into fists for just a fraction of a second. What was he afraid of? She looked down at Lucy, who was still clinging to her. "Mama." Lucy's voice was almost too soft to hear. Clara knelt before her, brushing damp curls from her daughter's face. "Tell me again, sweetheart," she whispered. "What do you mean Papa is trapped?" Lucy's wide, glistening eyes flickered toward the coffin. She hesitated, then whispered, "Papa is stuck in there. He's calling me. He's scared." A sharp, icy dread stabbed through Clara's chest. She turned, her gaze locking onto the coffin. It was made of solid oak, the lid firmly sealed with heavy brass nails. A final, unyielding barrier between life and death. And yet, Madame Rose placed a weathered hand on Clara's arm. "The child isn't making things up," she murmured. "I've seen this before." Clara turned sharply. "What do you mean?" The old woman hesitated, then spoke in a hushed tone, as if fearing the very words she uttered. "Many years ago, there was a man. He was thought to be dead, but he had only fallen into a deep coma. They buried him, thinking he had passed." She exhaled, shaking her head. "But his family, they began having nightmares. His wife swore she heard him calling her name at night. And then..." She trailed off, her expression haunted. Clara's throat went dry. A cold sweat broke across the back of her neck. She looked back at the coffin, a horrific thought seeping into her mind like poison. What if... Lucy hiccuped, her little body trembling. "Papa is calling me," she whispered. The wind howled against the stained glass windows, sending eerie shudders through the church. A flickering candle on the altar sputtered, and then it went out. A few villagers exchanged nervous glances, their anxious whispers blending with the distant whistle of the wind. "This is a bad omen," a middle-aged woman muttered under her breath. The tension in the church coiled tighter, pressing against Clara's ribs like an iron vice. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. What should she do? Margaret stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara, if you have even the slightest doubt, don't let them bury Samuel just yet." The word struck Clara like a knife to the chest. She wanted to believe that this was nothing more than the wild imagination of a grieving child, that Lucy's innocent mind was simply unable to grasp the reality of death. But deep down in the raw, unshakable core of a wife's intuition, she knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The shadows in St. Michael's Church thickened, stretching ominously across the cold stone floor. The murmurs of the villagers grew louder, laced with unease, as more of them stepped back from the coffin. Clara remained frozen, her pulse thudding violently in her ears. Henry had left, but his reaction to Lucy's words lingered in her mind. The way he had tensed, the way he had quickly changed the subject. And then, as if the universe itself sought to answer her unspoken fears, a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a faint knock. From inside the coffin, gasps filled the church. Someone let out a sharp cry. Others stumbled backward, their faces drained of color. Clara's breath seized in her lungs. Lucy, her small frame rigid with fear, lifted her tear-streaked face and whispered, "Papa wants to come out." Clara clutched her daughter, Lucy, as the child trembled in her arms, her small fingers digging into her dress. "Mama," Lucy whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Papa is scared." A bone-chilling cold seeped into Clara's veins. No! It wasn't possible. Samuel was dead. They had prepared his body, arranged his funeral. He was gone. But what if he wasn't? The mere thought sent a surge of nausea through Clara's body, making it hard to breathe. She tried to ground herself, to find logic amidst the suffocating rumors, the villagers' fearful gazes and the thick, unshakable unease pressing down on her like an unseen force. Then, a voice shattered the tense silence. "Clara," she turned sharply. Standing at the entrance of the dimly lit church was Matthew, one of Samuel's closest friends. His breath came in ragged gasps, as though he had been running. His face, tense with urgency, made Clara's heart hammer against her ribs. "I just heard. I got here late," Matthew panted. "But there's something you need to know." Clara frowned, her body stiff with tension. "What is it?" Matthew hesitated for only a moment before striding toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Before Samuel died, he mentioned something important," he said, his expression grave. "I don't know if this is the right time, but it has to do with Henry." At the mention of Henry's name, Clara's unease deepened. "Tell me," she demanded. Matthew glanced around, his eyes scanning the church as if afraid someone was listening. Then, leaning in closer, he whispered, "A few days before Samuel's accident, he told me Henry was pressuring him to sell the house. Samuel refused, and the next day, the accident happened." Clara felt a wave of ice wash over her. Her mind raced, replaying Henry's words from earlier. The way he had urgently pushed her to settle the matter of the house. The way he had remained outwardly calm, but visibly stiffened when Lucy mentioned Samuel being trapped. Could it be that Samuel's death wasn't an accident at all? Clara's hands trembled. "Matthew, are you saying?" Matthew swallowed hard. "I have no proof, but I know this. Samuel never trusted Henry. He told me that if anything ever happened to him..." He hesitated, then finished in a hushed, chilling voice. "You shouldn't trust anyone, asterisk." Clara felt as though the air had been sucked out of her lungs. No, it couldn't be. But the pieces were beginning to fit together in a terrifying way. Suddenly, Lucy yanked at Clara's sleeve, her little face pale with fear. "Mama," she whimpered. "Papa is crying." The church fell into a stunned silence. Madame Rose stepped back. Others in the crowd exchanged fearful glances, murmuring prayers under their breath. Clara knelt before Lucy, her voice trembling. "Lucy," she whispered, "what did you say?" Lucy pointed a trembling finger toward the coffin, her lip quivering. "Papa is crying." Inside, a suffocating stillness swallowed the room. Then, thud! A dull sound echoed through the church. No one spoke. No one moved. Was it just an illusion? A trick of the mind? Then it came again. Thud! Thud! Asterisk! Asterisk! This time, Clara wasn't the only one who heard it. The crowd stirred. Some villagers gasped. Others stumbled backward, their faces pale as death. Madame Rose trembled, repeatedly making the sign of the cross. "Dear God," she whispered. Margaret clutched her hands together, her voice shaking. "Clara, we should open the coffin." Clara could barely breathe. Her knees felt weak, her mind spiraling in horror. But just as she was about to step forward, a sharp voice cut through the air. "No one is to touch it." Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Henry had returned. He stood rigid in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with something dark. "Don't let superstition cause chaos," he snapped, his voice tight. "This is ridiculous." But Clara saw it, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, the way a bead of sweat glistened on his temple. Henry was afraid, and Clara knew why. Another sound echoed through the church. Thud. More women shrieked, clutching onto each other in terror. The once somber funeral had transformed into a living nightmare. Lucy pressed her face into Clara's dress, sobbing. "Mama, Papa is calling you." The flickering candles on the altar wavered, casting trembling shadows along the stone walls. Clara turned to Henry, her unease solidifying into something else. Asterisk, asterisk, certainty, asterisk, asterisk. "What are you hiding, Henry?" she demanded. His expression darkened. "Are you insane, Clara? You want to open a coffin because of a child's nonsense?" Clara's voice rose, trembling with raw emotion. "Asterisk, asterisk, and what about the knocking, Henry?" Asterisk, asterisk, his jaw clenched. "The wind," he snapped. "It's just the wind." Matthew took a step forward, his sharp gaze locked onto Henry. "Then let us open it," he said coldly, "and prove you're right." A heavy silence fell over the room. The tension coiled like a snake, wrapping its icy grip around every soul inside the church. Henry's breath hitched. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then, thud, the coffin shook. Several villagers gasped, stepping backward in fear. Someone prayed under their breath. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. "No!" Henry's voice cracked. His eyes darted wildly around the room. "No one is to touch it," but his outburst condemned him further. James, an elder in the village, stepped forward, his aged but steady voice cutting through the tension. "Henry," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "if you have nothing to hide, let us open the coffin." Henry's knuckles turned white. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His lips pressed into a thin line. Clara stepped toward him, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "Why are you so afraid, Henry?" Henry's chest rose and fell rapidly. His eyes darted between Clara, Matthew, the villagers, then the coffin. The air in the church turned thick, suffocating. And then Lucy let out a piercing scream. Everyone spun toward her. The child stood rigid, her small hand raised, pointing straight at Henry. Her voice was barely more than a breath. "Asterisk, asterisk, Papa says you did this. Asterisk, asterisk." The heavy scent of burning candles and aged wood filled St. Michael's Church, casting a somber weight upon the grieving villagers. The walls seemed to whisper with the voices of the departed, their echoes trapped between the towering stained-glass windows. Clara stood in the dim glow, her daughter Lucy clutching the folds of her dress with trembling fingers. "Mama, Papa is scared." Lucy's small voice wavered, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto the closed coffin at the altar. A chilling cold slithered down Clara's spine. No, it wasn't possible. Samuel was dead. He had to be. But what if he wasn't? The mere thought stole the air from her lungs. She gripped Lucy's tiny hand tighter, struggling to ground herself as whispers rippled through the crowd, hushed murmurs of unease. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old wooden doors of the church. Then, a sound, a single hollow thud. The air inside the church stilled. The flickering candle flames trembled. Clara's breath hitched. Her pulse pounded like a war drum in her ears. Had she imagined it? Thud. This time, others heard it too. The crowd stiffened, fear widening their eyes. Some clutched their rosaries, lips moving in silent prayers. Thud, thud, louder now, more urgent. Lucy whimpered, "Mama, Papa is knocking." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The coffin, Samuel's coffin, The knocking was coming from inside. A gasp rippled through the congregation. Madame Rose, the village's eldest healer, took a staggering step back, making the sign of the cross over and over. The child, someone whispered in terror. She truly sees him. No! A sharp voice rang out. Henry! He stood at the church entrance, his face pale as death, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned bone white. His voice cracked with desperation. No one touches a coffin. It's just the wood contracting from the cold. But no one believed him. Clara turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Henry's. She saw it then, the flicker of something dark beneath his forced composure. Fear, guilt. Her heart clenched. Matthew, Samuel's closest friend, stepped forward, his voice razor-sharp. If you're so sure, Henry, then let us open it. Prove us wrong. Henry's face twisted in raw panic. No, he barked, lunging forward. Clara's temper, buried beneath grief and fear, ignited. Then tell me, Henry, she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like steel. Why are you afraid? Henry swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. This is madness. Matthew's voice was a quiet blade. Or maybe you already know what we'll find. A stunned silence fell. Then, slap. Henry's palm struck Clara across the face, the sound cracking through the church like thunder. Gasps erupted. Lucy screamed, clinging to her mother. Matthew roared, fury blazing in his eyes as he charged at Henry, slamming a fist into his jaw. Henry stumbled back, crashing onto the stone floor. Clara barely noticed. The only thing she could hear was the knocking, relentless, desperate. Thud, thud, thud. Tears streaked Lucy's face. Mama, Papa is calling you. Clara's breath shuddered. Enough. Her hands trembled as she reached for the coffin lid. This was it. The truth lay beneath. She would face it, no matter what. Fingers tightening, she inhaled sharply. And then a scream. A single, blood-curdling scream tore through the church. Henry lunged like a wild animal, his eyes bloodshot, his face a mask of terror. No one opens that coffin. The air inside St. Michael's Church had turned thick, dense with fear, heavy with the weight of something unnatural. The once solemn funeral had unraveled into sheer chaos. The mourners frozen in terror, their eyes fixed on the coffin at the altar. The only sound was the uneven breathing of the villagers and the soft, stifled sobs of a little girl. Thud! The sound came from within the coffin, a hollow, desperate knock. Clara's grip on her daughter tightened as Lucy buried her face into her mother's dress, her small frame trembling. Mama, Papa is scared, she whimpered, voice barely above a whisper. Clara felt something snap inside her. Enough. No more fear, no more hesitation. Whatever lay inside that coffin, truth or nightmare, she was going to face it. Henry, however, had lost all composure, his face contorted in pure panic as he scrambled to his feet. Don't open it, he shrieked, his voice bordering on hysteria. Leave it alone. Leave Samuel alone. Smack. Matthew's fist connected with Henry's jaw, sending him sprawling onto the cold stone floor. Henry writhed in pain, yet his screams didn't cease. You don't understand. You'll regret this. He clutched at the ground, his nails scratching against the stone as if trying to escape some unseen terror. Clara's patience had run dry. What are you so afraid of, Henry? She demanded, her voice laced with fury. Tell us the truth right now. I. Henry's breath hitched, his eyes darting wildly around the room. Then, as if possessed, he started mumbling to himself, shaking his head over and over. No, 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 no. Matthew turned to Clara, his jaw tight. We do this now. James stepped beside them, his expression hard as stone. Clara inhaled sharply, her hands trembling as she reached for the coffin lid. Bang! Stop! A deep, commanding voice thundered from the entrance. The entire church turned. Standing in the doorway, his long black robes billowing slightly, was Father Manuel. His face was grim, his dark eyes scanning the fearful congregation. "What are you all doing?" Matthew rushed toward him. "Father, something is wrong. There are noises coming from the coffin." His voice wavered, the weight of the words almost too much to bear. "We have to open it." The priest's gaze settled on Clara. "Are you certain?" Her throat felt dry. Was she certain? Beside her, Lucy clutched her hand tighter. Papa is scared," she repeated, her teary eyes pleading. Clara's heart clenched. She looked up at the priest, voice shaking. "I don't know, but I can't bury my husband with this doubt." Father Manuel's expression darkened. Slowly, he stepped toward the coffin. The air around them felt suffocating, as if the very walls of the church were closing in. A deep, unnatural silence fell over the room. Then, thud, thud, louder, more frantic. A scream tore through the congregation. Madame Rose staggered back, whispering frantic prayers. Several villagers bolted for the door in sheer terror. On the floor, Henry let out an anguished wail. "Don't open it," he cried, his body shaking violently. "Please, you don't know what you're doing." Clara ignored him. She turned to the priest. Father Manuel nodded. "Open it." But before Clara could lift the lid, "Wait!" A voice rang out from the entrance. A man stumbled inside, panting, his clothes disheveled, as if he had run miles to get here. Esteban, the forensic doctor. His face was drenched in sweat, panic burning in his eyes. "Don't open that coffin!" The entire church froze. Clara's heart lurched. "Why?" she asked, breathless. Esteban rushed forward. "There's been a mistake," he gasped. "I checked Samuel's death certificate. Something isn't right." Silence. Matthew's fist clenched. "What are you saying?" The doctor swallowed hard. "The certificate was signed by a doctor I don't recognize. I checked with the hospital. No one officially confirmed Samuel's death." A sharp gasp echoed through the church. Clara felt the world tilt. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto her knees, clutching Lucy close. Henry let out a strangled, inhuman scream. "No! No! No! No!" Matthew's voice was like a blade slicing through the air. "What does that mean?" Esteban turned to Clara, his voice heavy as stone. "It means Samuel was never dead." The church erupted into screams. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. She turned toward the coffin, her trembling hand reaching for the lid. She was going to open it, but before she could, bang! The heavy wooden church doors slammed shut. The candles flickered, then died, plunging the room into suffocating darkness. Screams erupted from the congregation. People shoved, scrambling to escape, but the doors wouldn't budge. "Who locked the doors?" someone cried. Madame Rose fell to her knees, whispering prayers with shaking hands. "This is an omen of punishment." Clara clutched Lucy tightly, trying to steady her own breath. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "Mama's here." Then, ha, ha, ha. A slow, eerie laughter filled the darkened church. It sent ice through Clara's veins. Everyone turned. There, in the center of the church, bathed in the faint glow of the remaining candlelight, stood Henry. Sweat dripped down his face. His bloodshot eyes gleamed, and his lips curled into a manic grin. You should have listened. His voice was barely human. Thud, thud, from within the coffin. The knocking continued. To be continued? A cold wind howled through St. Michael's Church, rattling the candles and sending shadows flickering wildly across the stone walls. Fear gripped the air, thick and suffocating, as the desperate pounding from inside the coffin sent shockwaves of terror through the congregation. "Don't open it!" Henry howled, his voice once firm and commanding now cracking under sheer desperation. He staggered backward, shaking his head violently, sweat pouring down his pale face. Father Manuel took a measured step forward, his tone steady but sharp. "Henry, what do you know?" Henry let out a strangled gasp, as if the question alone had stolen the air from his lungs. "No, no, don't ask me that." His hands trembled, his entire body vibrating with fear. Matthew stormed toward him, eyes burning with rage. "What did you do to Samuel?" His fists clenched as he grabbed Henry by the collar, his voice a furious growl. Henry's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his body racked with uncontrollable shivers. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, his lips trembling as he muttered brokenly, I didn't mean to." Clara, standing motionless, felt her fingers curl into fists, her nails digging into her palm. "What did you do?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut through bone. Henry sobbed, his words tumbling out like a dam had broken. "I just wanted what was mine. I wanted Samuel to sell me the house, but he refused. He said he'd never sell it." A cold shiver ran down Clara's spine. "So you killed him?" Henry screamed, shaking his head so violently it looked like he might snap his own neck. No, I didn't. I only wanted to scare him. I put something in his drink, just enough to knock him out. But," his voice cracked, his face contorting into something unrecognizable. "But he never woke up." The entire church was deathly still. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her, a deafening ringing filling her ears. You drugged my husband?" Henry nodded, his breath ragged. I didn't know he was allergic. I didn't know it would kill him. When he wouldn't wake up, I panicked." His voice dropped to a whisper. "So I bribed the doctor to fake the death certificate. I thought he was already dead." The silence was suffocating. Matthew's voice was low, dangerous. "You thought?" Clara took a slow, trembling step forward, her fist shaking. "You didn't even check?" Henry let out a pitiful whimper. I was too afraid." She stared at him, horror sinking into her bones like ice. "And you let them bury him." Henry fell apart. He sobbed uncontrollably, his entire body shaking. No, I didn't know. But before he could finish, bang, 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 the pounding inside the coffin grew violent. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Screams erupted from the villagers, panic crashing through the church like a tidal wave. Henry's eyes bulged, his skin draining of all color. No, but it can't be. Father Manuel made the sign of the cross. Then, his voice a command, "Open the coffin." Clara sucked in a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling, but she knew this was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She turned to Matthew and James, her voice barely a whisper. "Do it." The two men stepped forward, placing their hands on the lid. A chilling wind rushed through the church, sending the candles flickering wildly. Henry shrieked, crawling backward in pure panic. "No, don't open it. Don't." But it was too late. With a groaning creak, the coffin lid was lifted, and there he was, Samuel. A choked sob tore from Clara's throat as she collapsed to her knees. Samuel's body trembled, his skin ghostly pale, his lips cracked from dehydration. His breath was faint, but he was breathing. His eyes fluttered open, weak but unmistakably alive. "Samuel," Clara cried, hands shaking as she cupped his face. He was ice cold, but he was alive. Lucy burst into tears, her tiny hands gripping her father's limp arm. Papa, I'm here." A faint breath escaped Samuel's lips. His fingers twitched. Clara let out a strangled sob, pressing his hand to her heart. "Don't leave me. Samuel, don't leave me." The church was in an uproar. Gasps, cries of disbelief, prayers whispered frantically. Matthew ripped off his coat, draping it over Samuel's frail frame. "We need to get him help. Now." Father Manuel knelt beside Samuel, his voice calm but urgent. "Water. Now." Margaret, trembling, bolted toward the back of the church. Samuel's lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but he was too weak. Then a shriek cut through the chaos. No, this is a demon. Everyone turned. Henry was crawling across the floor, his face twisted in terror, his eyes wild and unhinged. No, no, no. Samuel is dead. He has to be dead. Matthew's fury exploded. He lunged, his fist connecting hard with Henry's jaw. Henry hit the floor with a sickening thud. Shut the hell up. Henry whimpered, but his screams didn't stop. He thrashed like a madman, shaking his head violently. No, no. Samuel can't be alive. Clara rose to her feet, her vision blurred with fury. Why are you so afraid, Henry? Henry sobbed, backing away like a cornered animal. I didn't mean to. James' voice was thunderous. You buried him alive. Gasps filled the church. The villagers' fear shifted. No longer was it terror of the unknown. It was rage. Madame Rose clutched her rosary, tears streaming down her aged face. Margaret returned, clutching a pitcher of water, but her hands trembled too violently to move. The church doors creaked open with a slow, ominous groan. A cold wind rushed in, and as Clara held Samuel in her arms, watching Henry crumble under the weight of his sins, she realized this night had unearthed more than just a buried man. It had unearthed a monster. The heavy silence in the church was broken by a chilling voice. Call the police. This crime cannot go unpunished, hissed an elderly woman, gripping her rosary tightly. Father Manuel, his face grim yet determined, gave a firm nod and gestured to Matthew. We must get Samuel outside immediately. He needs urgent care. The villagers, still paralyzed by the shocking revelation, watched as Matthew and several men carefully lifted Samuel from the coffin. His body was frail, his skin ice cold, but his fingers twitched slightly as if clinging to the last threads of life. Clara grasped her husband's trembling hand, tears blurring her vision. Hold on, Samuel. Stay with me. You have to live. Beside her, little Lucy, her face streaked with tears, patted her father's cheek with her small hands. Papa, wake up. I miss you so much. A weak breath escaped Samuel's cracked lips, his tear-filled eyes locking onto Clara's. He had heard it all. The lies, the betrayal, and the truth that had almost buried him alive. Just then, the wail of sirens pierced the night. 2 police cars screeched to a stop in front of the church, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows against the ancient stone walls. An ambulance followed closely behind. Sheriff Anderson stepped out, his sharp gaze sweeping over the terrified crowd. What the hell is going on here? Matthew stormed forward, his voice ringing with fury. Henry tried to kill Samuel. He bribed the doctor, faked the death certificate, and had him buried alive. Gasps erupted from the villagers. Some whispered prayers. Others trembled in horror. Sheriff Anderson's expression turned to ice as he turned to Henry. Arrest him. Now. 2 officers surged forward, grabbing Henry by the arms and yanking him to his feet. No, no, I'm innocent, Henry shrieked, thrashing wildly. But the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around his wrists, sealing his fate. Matthew stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. You will pay for everything you've done. Sheriff Anderson turned back to Clara, his voice firm yet sympathetic. We'll conduct a full investigation. But first, Samuel needs immediate medical attention. Clara nodded, barely able to speak through her tears. She clutched Samuel's hand tighter, feeling the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was still breathing. He was still alive. Lucy sniffled, her tiny arms wrapped around her father. Papa, can we go home now? A ghost of a smile played on Samuel's lips. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but filled with love. Yes, my love. Let's go home. St. Stephen's Hospital, 3 days later. Morning sunlight spilled into the hospital room, casting a golden glow over Samuel's face. His breathing was steadier now, his skin no longer deathly pale, though weak. His eyes held a spark of life as he gazed at Clara and Lucy sitting beside him. "Papa," Lucy squealed, scrambling onto the bed and wrapping her arms around him. Her tiny hands gently traced his face, as if reassuring herself that he was truly there. "You're back!" Samuel exhaled a shaky breath, his gaze brimming with warmth. "I'm sorry, my love," he murmured, his voice raw with emotion. Clara's grip on his hand tightened, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. "Do you know how terrified we were?" Samuel nodded, his expression darkening. "I heard everything." Clara's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Samuel swallowed hard. "When I was trapped in that coffin, I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. But I could hear you. I heard Lucy. I heard Henry lying. I heard you all mourning me." His voice broke, and I was powerless to stop it. Clara sobbed, pressing her forehead to his. "I thought I lost you forever." Lucy clung to her father's arm, her voice soft but certain. "Mama saved you, Papa. She called me, and I heard her in my dreams. That's why I ran to you." Samuel's eyes misted over as he cupped his daughter's face. "Thank you, my little angel. You saved me." Outside the hospital room, Matthew and Father Manuel waited. As Clara stepped out, Matthew approached, his voice steady. "Henry has been locked up. He's going to trial." Clara nodded, her heart still heavy despite the justice that was unfolding. Father Manuel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Samuel was saved. That is what matters most. Clara took a deep breath, then gave a faint smile. "Yes, what matters most is that he's alive." Castleton Provincial Court. 1 week later. The courtroom buzzed with tension, filled with villagers who had come to witness justice being served. Henry Jimenez was led inside, his hands shackled tightly, his face hollow, drained of its usual arrogance. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. The prosecutor's voice rang through the chamber. The defendant, Henry Jimenez, is charged with attempted murder, falsification of a death certificate, and the deliberate burial of a living person. Samuel Herrera. A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. But Clara remained still, her gaze locked onto Henry. He was no longer a powerful man. He was nothing more than a coward, broken and awaiting judgment. The judge's gavel struck the desk. The court will now deliver the sentence. "Wait!" A firm voice cut through the air. All eyes turned to the man standing at the back of the courtroom. Samuel. He leaned on a cane, his body still frail, but his gaze steady and unwavering. Slowly, he stepped forward, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I have something to say before the court sentences him." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Samuel locked eyes with Henry, his tone calm but piercing. "Henry, I don't hate you." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Samuel's voice hardened. "But I despise you." His words sliced through the air like a blade. "You betrayed our family. You betrayed your own honor. And now, you will face the consequences." Henry fell to his knees, sobbing. But there was no sympathy left for him. The judge's gavel slammed down one final time. Henry Jimenez is hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison. The room erupted in applause. But Clara? She simply closed her eyes and exhaled. The nightmare was finally over. 1 month later, the Herrera home. Golden sunlight bathed the house, warmth finally returning to a home that had once been filled with sorrow. Samuel stood on the porch, gazing over the vast fields, his hand clasped tightly in Clara's. Lucy ran across the yard, her laughter ringing through the air, as free and joyful as a bird in flight. Clara turned to her husband, her voice barely a whisper. "We're really home." Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with peace. "Yes, and I will never leave you or Lucy again." Lucy ran up to them. throwing her arms around their legs. "We're a family. No one can take us apart anymore." Clara smiled, pressing a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead. "That's right, my love. We will always be together." As the sun set over the horizon, their shadows intertwined. Three souls forever bound by love, resilience, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Because in the end, justice always prevails.